I mean, I would argue that there's no way I think Flutter is going to be number one in 10 years, but we'll see.
Yeah, you and I are both betting on that effectively.
The Business of Betting podcast is presented by Optimove, the #1 CRM marketing solution for the iGaming industry. 4 out of the top 5 U.S. operators personalize player experiences with Optimove, the #1 CRM marketing solution for the iGaming industry. Learn more about Optimove by requesting a demo at optimove.com/businessofbetting. And if you like what you see, you will get your first month free.
What is up, everybody? I am Jason Trost, the host of the Business of Betting podcast. Today, I have Davis Catlin joining from Discerning Capital, managing partner. Welcome to the pod, Davis.
Thanks for having me on, Jason. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. Well, that's a lovely background behind you. Where does this podcast find you?
I am in Lyon, France, in the Sofitel lobby right now.
Oh, fantastic. What are you doing in France?
My kids had never been before, so I get up, I spend the mornings with them, show them a little bit of Europe, and then I work from about noon until 11 p.m. But the kids are loving it, so it's worth it.
That's very cool. How long are you going for?
My total trip time is 4 weeks in Europe, but 6 weeks out of the desert that is Las Vegas.
Interesting. My wife's from France. I don't know if you knew that. So every once in a while we pop down to France, and I love it. It's a great place, especially for holiday. I mean, it's a country that's built for holidays, not built for technology companies very much, but it's definitely very good for holidays.
So my kids, we live in Vegas, right? And my daughter, she's 11. We were walking through Paris, and she was like, "Dad, all the buildings here are so pretty." And I was like, "Yeah, it's amazing, right? We have like the Paris and Las Vegas." She's like, "But every street's better than those." And I was like, that is true, honey. Like, this is even better than the fake Paris that you're used to. But we're excited to be on.
They decided to take the Eiffel Tower from Vegas and put it into France. That was so beautiful. So it's a nice mixing of the two cultures.
That's true.
Cool. Well, one of the issues I wanted to jump in. So for those of you who are listening who are not familiar with Discerning Capital, actually, before we jump in, why don't you give a quick introduction to Discerning Capital and your bona fides in sports betting?
Sure. So Discerning Capital is an investment management firm focused on the intersection of regulated gambling with sports, media, and general technology. So our view is that by focusing on the regulated side of gambling and being willing to be licensed ourselves, we can access and sort of provide capital to companies that can't get traditional financing. And so that's our entire business. We offer it on the equity side, which is our core, meaning we do sort of growth equity investments between, say, 5 and 25 million is our range. And then we also have a private credit strategy to sort of help finance the user acquisition of sports betting companies. So that's what we do. But really, we're sort of growth investors who, I always joke, I'm like, a lot of people in our industry are gamblers turned corporate. We're actually a little bit different. We're corporate turned into the gambling industry. So we've just sort of come at this a little differently.
And do you do like casino and poker and stuff like that? Or do you focus on sports?
We'll do anything. So anywhere that there's a growing business with competitive moats that needs growth capital, we're willing to do it. So we've done everything from a used slot machine reseller, sort of like eBay for used slots, to a fast growing sportsbooks in Australia and the UK, and just recently a payments business that focuses on account to account payments and regulated gambling. So we'll go anywhere, but we just want our expertise to be helpful to the business.
And does sweeps count as regulated or unregulated?
Sweeps is an interesting thing. We have not gotten involved in sweeps, so we're just jumping right into it. I think it'd be fair to say that I was initially pretty sort of cautious or negative of like, this wasn't what was intended. Then I went through a phase of saying, well, actually, there are regulations here. And, sort of where I would just say DFS Plus as an example, sort of takes a law and extends it in a way that wasn't ever appreciated. But sweeps, there are laws, there are rules, there are regulations. So now with a crackdown, for anyone watching this later, there's sort of the last 2 weeks have been all the crackdowns, our state AGs and laws passing. We haven't been involved, but I also, part of me is like, I'm not happy that this is going away. I think that was a really innovative way to bring wagering and gaming into states that hadn't formalized it yet. So I am sad to see it go, but no, we have not yet done anything at sweepstakes. We've looked at a lot. We're intrigued, But I do think those companies are going to have a hard time raising money going forward. Even if I'm intrigued by it, it's like, how do you invest in that? Where there's a version of the law that anyone that does one that goes into New York, the investors become criminals. Like that's a high cost. I hadn't seen that before. So, but yeah, so sweeps would have sort of been on the fringe of what we do. Most of what we do is sort of getting licensed in Australia, getting licensed in the UK. That's sort of our sweet spot.
The old boring stuff. So, speaking of the old boring stuff, it feels like it's getting the shit kicked out of it these days. So, like, on one hand, you have sweeps. On another hand, you have this CFTC wormhole that's been opened up. And then, just before we went on air, like 30 minutes ago, I started reading in the Big Beautiful Bill, which is a hilarious name for a law to pass Congress, which has not passed yet at the time of this recording. There's a provision in there where gamblers can only deduct 90% of their losses instead of 100% of their losses. So just to bring everybody up to speed, the way sports betting works is all your winnings are taxable, but you can deduct your losses. So if you win 10,000, lose 10,000, your net winnings is zero, your tax liability is zero. In practice, I think most small bettors never end up filing, and operators, I think, over 1,200 or 1,500 are obligated to do withholding. So with withholding, the operator has to tell the IRS under £1,000, under $1,000. I think most people probably don't bother filing. But the way this works is anything over above zero is a taxable event in the United States. And now, like I said, I just read this, which is mental. It's mental, where only 90% of your losses can be deducted. So you have a case where, let's say you bet 10,000 and let's say you won 10,000 and lost 10,000. You have a taxable income of $1,000, which just kind of belies logic. Are you up to speed on this more than I am? Because I just have been reading about this for 15 minutes and asking ChatGPT some questions about the bill. Where are you at with your learnings on this?
Yeah, so I fell deep down the sort of LinkedIn, Twitter gambling rabbit hole on this as well over the last 24 hours. I think there's still a lot of questions about it. So somebody had pointed out this idea of like, when do you count your losses and when are they done? Is it like I sit at a blackjack table, I win $10, I lose $10, I win $10, I lose $10, and each one of those is sort of, you can't write that off. Is it when you settle up? Most people think online, but let's just think a casino. When I settle up and take my chips to cash, is that the point? Is it across my trip if I'm in Vegas for a week and I bet every day? And I think those are the sorts of questions.
Surely it would be a tax year issue, no? Like, wouldn't it be a tax year? So the calendar year?
So, but then this is where the worst version is, it's sort of every time you cash out and have losses, it sort of becomes each one. Or is it a question of at the end of the year? Because this is where the law just isn't clear yet. Is it on the tax year, all of your losses, I lost at MGM, I won at DraftKings, I used to be able to net those two? Or is it like each quarter, did you lose or gain in a market? So that's where I think there's a question of whether or not it's reopening what I will call traditional gambling tax law. And that's where I was just reading this person being like, we'll have to see how the regulations come out, because I agree with you. The only way to make this reasonable is to do it on a yearly basis, so that if my account at the Venetian, my account at the Wynn, you net those versus being some sort of per hand, per quarter, per month, per trip. I think that's where it gets just chaotic to do all of that. So I would tell you that I was reading that I believe it's the Democratic senator from Nevada is already trying to put forth a sort of repeal of that section because they view it as bad for that part of the economy. I actually saw my good friend and industry stalwart here, Chris Grove, say something online about this as well, commenting on someone. And he was sort of making the point that the reason that we've been targeted is because we're easy to target. We're gambling. Professional gamblers are not something that the average voter cares about. So when you're writing a bill that has a lot of spending and you've got to find some unpopular targets to go after, gambling losses is 98% of people, 99.9 probably, if we're honest, they just don't care. So it's an easy place to go get some money. I just think the implementation is the big question.
My very naive review of the bill it'd be like capital gains. Like, it doesn't matter if you did it Jan 1 or December 31st, it all kind of gets lumped together and you net it off at the end of the year. So I don't think it would be hand by hand or bookmaker by bookmaker. I think it's like capital gains. It doesn't matter if you're using Fidelity or Schwab, your capital gains all net off.
Yeah, I mean, I've only read enough to be dangerous and reading actual people that are experts in gambling tax law. I do a lot of investments, but I also am not a gambler, as I mentioned. So I've never had to file taxes for gambling, not yet.
Speaking about sweeps and CFTC, my, again, grantedly naive take on this would be this wouldn't apply to sweeps. This would not apply to CFTC, which is another kind of like head scratcher that the sort of the quote unquote front door regulated route for sports betting is getting the shit kicked out of it when these, like, you have this sort of questionable legality of the sweeps model, you have the questionable legality of the CFTC model, which both have very, very huge advantages for the operator and the customer to be using those mechanisms over a quote unquote regulated sportsbook.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're speaking to one of the great conundrums in our industry. It's been constant for 10 years is the cost of doing it right in gambling is often taken so high that the cost of doing it in what some described as an extra legal way becomes really attractive. I mean, there is a reason that these Bovadas of the world, not to pick on them, but just as an example, those are really profitable businesses. So I think if you continue to target regulated players, whether it's through additional taxes, whether it's through, and actually, I mean, that's obviously been a huge thing recently, is that states raising their tax rates after the fact. But I think, you're just making it so hard for the people that are trying to do it within the regulatory framework to win. If today, and Jason, I'll ask it to you this way. If you had to, no one knew you, you didn't have a podcast, and you were just some guy sitting on your couch, and you're thinking up ideas of how to make money, would you choose today to go the regulated sportsbook route, or would you go sweeps, Cauchy alternative, you name it? What would you do?
Yeah, the unregulated route. I was fortunate when I started Smarkets in 2008, 9, 10. It was still pretty early days, and the regulation was very light touch. And now it's really heavy. Like, I talked to a guy the other day that wanted to start a regulated betting exchange in the UK, and I was just thinking of like all the shit you would have to do for KYC, AML, which literally did not exist 15 years ago. And it's not that a good idea in general for that regulation to be in place, but the way it's implemented is so onerous and so expensive for the operator. Like, I founded Smarkets with we were 2 people to start, but we launched when we were like 10 people. Like, I don't think you could do a 10-person, regulated sportsbook today. You could do an unregulated sportsbook and skip all these things probably, but.
And how do you get the money together to go do that with all the regulations? Well, with all the regulations, I mean, around investing into regulated gambling, it's probably this and banks, and maybe probably cannabis, I suppose, but I don't have experience with that. But those are the hardest parts of the market to raise capital because you have restrictions around ownership, you have rules and regs and regulations in each state. So you're talking about an industry where I think you're right. Like, you used to be able to launch a sports book sort of out of your garage almost. And now at this point, with all the KYC, like, you almost have to have a compliance person day zero. And you have to have payments, you have to be in the right banks instead of it. Just, I have a meta thesis here that I think we're making it so hard for regulated sports books that I do believe that much of the innovation on the new products will be outside of general regulated gambling.
I think you're right. And ultimately, in my opinion, the big loser is the consumer, because the less competition you have, the less pricing pressure you can have, the less competitive forces, yada, yada, yada. I think ultimately the one that, it sounds on the outside, yeah, fuck it, let's tax these gambling companies, let's regulate them to the hilt. But ultimately, the people who end up paying for it is Joe and Bob, who are betting 50 quid or $50 to watch their favorite NFL team. And they're just getting ripped off with the odds that they have to get charged in order to fund the whole thing. So ultimately, the end consumer is the one who pays for all this stuff. And it's unfortunate because, it could be a vibrant part of the economy, but it's kind of getting the shit kicked out of it. And I don't think anybody, even if you like FanDuel, DraftKings, I don't think anybody wants only those 2 providers to survive over the next 10, 20 years. I don't think we're in danger of that, but we are in danger of not making it feasible for the newcomers to even enter the space. So it seems like we've kind of frozen around these, there's about 20 regulated sports books in the US, something like 30 maybe. Mm-hmm. And that number is going down instead of going up. And you would, for a vibrant market, you would want that number to go up.
Yeah, I agree. I think when you look around the world, they tend to be oligopolistic meaning there's normally like 3 or 4. Often it's 2 have the majority, and there's sort of a few that tag along. And then you have a very long tail, right? And that's normal. If you look at the UK, there's a long tail of sports books and casinos. Yeah, I had that question in the US. I mean, I think this is a very US specific commentary, to be fair. I think the regulations in the other markets are different. They can be just as onerous, but I think, my point is in the US specifically, I do think we're really making it hard to launch sort of the next DraftKings. It's unlikely to be, you launched a regulated book and you beat DraftKings at their own game. I think you're going to have to be innovating around the regulations. So I think that's where, I think that's sort of the new world order. So for us, as investors, we're trying to figure out, okay, well, where are the places that you do see secular growth that are sort of category agnostic, as an example? That's where, just to use it as an example because it fits what I'm saying, but I didn't bring it up on purpose, but the deal we just closed this week into Yaspa. They're a payments provider, right? And they do real-time verification. Think of it as like, not only do they know that you have the money, but they can also check to see, like, can you afford the bet? So it's like real-time affordability checks, right? That process applies whether you're a regulated sportsbook, whether you're DFS, or you're sweepstakes, right? So I think that finding the tools providers or the parts of the industry that can sort of grow agnostic to category, I think those are the most interesting places for us as relates to being an investor today.
I think if I were an investor, I probably would see the world through those eyes. I mean, it's the picks and shovels method. It just feels so cautious. It's so it's like the safe choice, like everybody's going to need blue jeans and everybody's going to need like orange juice when they're in the coal mine and, all that kind of stuff.
We're buying toll booths is what you're saying. We're buying, interstates with toll booths. I think that's a fair criticism of what I said, but I will just to point this out. Our first investment ever was actually into a phrase we use for us, challenger brand in Australia, right? I will tell you, just to start here, when we did our first deal in Australia, we had so many of my sort of advisors and very senior people in this industry be like, oh, you're looking at Australia? That's a really tough market. And be like, okay, well, what has you worried about it? So, well, I just know it's a tough market. So, okay, well, like, can you be specific? And I actually feel like in some ways, Australia's, they didn't meet the regulations 5-7 years ago that have sort of given it this idea of it's a tough market, but it's actually, there's a lot of innovation happening there. And we did back a company called Picklebet there that was challenging the big incumbents there, right? There's the big Entains, the Flutters. They dominate those markets. And the way I describe it is they're sort of showing up to consumers as we're not your grandfather's sportsbook. Your dad might have bet at Ladbrokes, but you don't want to bet there. You're different. You want to have esports, which, by the way, is small, but it's part of their branding. And by doing that, they're actually able to target customers sort of in the 20 to 35 sort of market really effectively, which is the next generation of bigger players, bigger bettors. So we did that thesis there. It's worked very nicely. The business has done very well. And then we actually just made an investment at the end of last year into Midnight, which is a very similar business in the UK. So when the results are showing us that you are able to kind of go from sort of subscale to growth capital can allow you to emerge into sort of the oligopoly, if you will, I think we're happy to take those shots. I mean, we've done 4 deals now and 2 of them are in that category. So, but I think it's a fair thing. When I do a seed deal into gambling as a B2C sportsbook, it's not for me, right? I could just go the roulette wheel and spin at that point.
Well, if you take the midnights of like the market I know the best is the UK. It's a UK company, I believe. Like, you probably could count the number of sports books that have started the last 10 years on one hand, or at least the ones that get to a certain scale. Like, it's very rare, even in the UK market. For what I like about the UK market is you pay your fee, you do the regulation, you get a license. Like, you don't have to go through a casino and no. So, like, I think the regulation's too expensive to operate under, and there's a lot of onerous requirements, but it is democratic in the sense that anybody can do it as long as you pay your fee and you do what they say. You can start a sportsbooks tomorrow, which I really appreciate. But even within that framework, the midnights, like, I mean, maybe I probably should know better, but I can't name really too many other sportsbooks other than like them that have started. Can you?
Well, so I think there's a long tail of like really small players. I actually saw this number, but I don't want to misquote it. But there is a lot of licensed sports books in the UK. But I think it is a very long tail of like you and I can't name it because they never reach £1 million in turnover. And they're just sort of like, you launch with Radar, you launch maybe an Evolution through an integration, and you hope to hit pay dirt. And if it doesn't work, you just close it down. So that's where I think there have been brands launched. I think it is very hard to do what Midnight and Picklebet have done, where they've gone from, and actually Dabble would be another one. I think those guys have built a great business in Australia, now sort of moving around the world. And they're in the same sort of category of challenger brands. And they've gone from a nobody on the long tail up and through. And this gets to sort of the next question. And I think we're sort of yet to see this. And this is sort of a question mark for me in this industry over the next decade is, will Flutter still be number one? And will DraftKings and FanDuel, will they remain at the top, right? Do these oligopolies remain static? Or do you actually have transition periods where the number one becomes the number five on its way out? I think history would tell us that all empires fall. So I think if you're Flutter and you're Entain or anyone else who's on the larger scale, I think your best bet is to be buying anyone that's up and coming, just to ensure that you never get sort of overthrown, if you will. But I think that's the big question is like, do we end up in a world where like, are the winners set in stone or are the winners set for this decade?
I mean, I would argue that there's no way I think Flutter is going to be number one in 10 years, but we'll see.
Yeah, you and I are both betting on that effectively.
I mean, a good counterexample is Microsoft. I mean, they were left for dead in the, 2010s or whatever, like the end of the Steve Ballmer era. It was just kind of like a dead tech company. And, they've turned things around to become one of the most, if not the most valuable publicly traded company. As I assume you're American. I'm American. I've noticed that Americans tend to, want to invest in America. First of all, America's huge and, we're good at capitalism and we're good at technology. Like, what makes you look further afield to Australia and UK for your investments?
I'd say, I think point one is valuation. I hate to say that, like I'm not a value investor, but, at the same time we did our investment into Picklebet, there was another business in the US that raised around the same time, same revenues, and they raised at something like 8 or 10 times the valuation we were paying in Australia. And, I just think I think everyone is so comfortable in the US that every investor, every family office, every sort of venture capital firm, when they're like, oh, look what we're going to be number 3 behind FanDuel and DraftKings. And I just don't think it's that easy, but I think there's enough capital here that it's driven those markets to sort of price success too early. I would say, I can't tip my hand too much here, but our next deal that we're working on is in the US, and it is sort of the industry around gambling, right? Gamblers don't just log into DraftKings and bet. There's communities, there's tools, there's data providers. And I think that's really interesting in the US because people, you sort of have to be in this industry to be able to identify the specific trends that make that so compelling.
Cool. Do you see those? This is like the odds jam is the one that comes to mind. I know there's a whole crop of those. Do you see those playing and increasingly? I guess they're sort of standing in for lack of innovation of the big providers to kind of give people more like a contextually rich sports betting experience. Like the big question for me, and I mean ourselves included, I'm like, why aren't the operators doing these things? Because there's kind of all these tools that you would think an operator would want to be able to provide.
So one, I think it is sort of the odds jam sorts of businesses are really attractive. Like that's one that we didn't know them when they sold, but I would have loved to have seen that business if they need growth capital. But I would say that those are the sorts of businesses that we think are really attractive. And I will tell you that I've been really surprised that we haven't seen more innovation inside the operators there. But I would also point to the fact of if I'm, Jason logging in on a Saturday to figure out, I want to bet on my favorite NFL team, or I'm a college football fan, so I'll use the Gators, right? If I want to bet on the Gators and I'm in Nevada, it's really annoying to have to go log in and see which of the 7 sports books that I have on my phone have the best odds on the Gators. So you kind of need to have an independent group. And I actually think the affiliates have historically done a pretty decent job with that. I just think now you're sort of seeing the next wave of the odds jams and sort of businesses stepping forward. But yeah, I mean, I think I'll just point something else here out that as much as all the large sports books, they get on their investor calls once a quarter and say, hey, we're bringing this in-house and we're bringing more technology in-house than ever and everything's coming in-house. The truth is that's just not like they might be doing that, but they're also signing new services, new innovative agreements to bring more product from using third parties. We had a B2B supplier that we were talking with a few months ago, and they had won one of the big guys in the US. And their development team said, we'll be 6 to 9 months before we can integrate you, just because of our pipeline of integrations. So, I mean, that's a long time. If your dev team is 9 months to integrate somebody you've already signed, like that doesn't tell me they've got a ton of extra bandwidth to be innovating and product and building. So I think there's a little bit of this industry is growing so rapidly. We're adding new bet types, new ways to bet, new promotions, new sort of versions of wagering at all times that I think it's just hard for anyone to keep up. So this is where the tools, though they need to be independent. And if I'll use Jason Robbins at DraftKings. If you're Jason, why am I building a tool? Yeah, I can help you find a bet on my service on DraftKings, but I'm not doing anything to show you what FanDuel has because I just spent $400 to acquire you.
We actually do that. We have in-app price comparison. So if Ladbrokes is a better price, we share it because I think you gain trust. And to your point, like you want to know like who has the best odds, and we all know the prices fluctuate, and why not share it? Jason Robbins should share it, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think honestly, you might be the only person I've heard of that does that.
Switching gears, you said you have kids. How old are your kids?
11, 9, and 6.
Okay, so similar ages to mine. How would you explain the ethics of gambling to your kids? Have your kids ever brought that up, and have you ever told them what you do for a living and had to talk about the morality of sports betting?
Yes, we talk about it frequently. It is sort of funny because often I'll say something to my daughter like, hey, what's that over there? She's like, you want to bet that, I could beat you for $5? And I'm like, oh man, like most kids just say, you want to bet, Dad? My kids know the $5 sort of the idea of it. I'll expand it a little broader, just to share. I am religious, so I'm a pretty strong on my faith Christian. That's actually where for me, there's more of a discussion around it is like, what does it mean to be in this industry? And my view is people have been wagering from casting lots in the Bible, right? There's multiple references to that. To my son, naturally, had ice cream a couple of days ago, wanting to race me to see who could finish, right? And what's the idea of what's at the end of it? I think this is inherently built into us. And I'll tell you the one place I feel very comfortable in what we do is I think the regulations in gambling are really good guardrails for that, right? I could go, as I mentioned, I'm in Lyon, France. I'd be willing to bet somewhere within 20 miles of me, there's an illegal casino. I don't know how to find that, but if I could, I'm sure there's someone who'll take a bet. And they do not care how old I am. They don't care if I can afford the bet. They don't care how I'm going to pay them, as long as I pay them. And by bringing that into a regulated world where we can look and say, okay, well, Davis wants to bet $1 million. How much money does Davis have? If Davis is a billionaire, maybe that's okay. But if Davis has $1 million to his name and this is like his life shot of, going bankrupt if this fails, that's not okay. And I just think that's where for me, like one, I think there's an inherent human desire to wager with outcomes. And I think there's the second part is in regulated gambling, I think if all of us look each other in the eye and say, yeah, let's do this better, right? Do I think that we should, I'll tell you this is actually one of my issues, generally sort of the extracurricular parts of gambling is the age changing, right? The rules and some of the sweeps guys, just to use them as examples, some of them have signed up and been very thoughtful over we're going to put this protection in proactively. And I think that's the stuff that makes me sleep well at night is knowing that those of us that are trying to build this industry to something really big, we also, right, we want this to be what Vegas is, right? For most people, 95% of people come to Vegas, they lose a couple $1,000, they have a steak dinner, they go see a show, they leave a little grumpy and hungover, but they're happy that they went. It was entertainment. And I think all of us have to take it very seriously around the responsibility to protect I think the number is likely very small, but let's say less than 2% of people that have propensity towards problems and addiction. I think that's really where we should all be spending our time focusing, like how do we protect those people while allowing the 98% of us just to go have fun. So sorry for the long answer there.
No, I like that answer. That was a nice way to think about it. I think about it like it's a math equation. So saying betting is immoral is like saying this fraction is immoral. I think the morality comes from the pricing, and that's where I think you're taking advantage of people. But the actual thing of a sports bet, I think, is math. So it's like, to me, it's like getting mad at math.
Well, yeah, and it's just fun. by the way. It's just fun, right? Sitting there, I'll never forget, one of the best kind of laughs and times in my life was me and my brother-in-law when I lived in the DC area, and we were in Nashville. We were having a couple beers. We were watching a college basketball game because it was the last thing on. We picked a random side of the bet, and there's the two of us both bet, and we had the best time sweating that. And we were laughing, and it was like, it's one of those like ridiculous nights, and it was just so much fun. And that, I think, is what gambling should be. And if we can try to get everyone to have that entertainment mindset, and this is fun, this is about friends, this is social, I think we're all better off.
Before I let you go, what do you want to be when you grow up?
I actually have spent a lot of time thinking about this. And I've spent a lot of time in my life in the last couple of years, sort of just going through different seasons, right? I went from working as a senior partner at a very big investment firm where I was challenged somewhat, especially when I started. It was really challenging and I learned a skill set, and then I felt really motivated. But then by the end, it was sort of like I was just doing the same thing for the last few years, just sort of felt like autopilot. Then I worked a big casino, made a bunch of money, and that was great. And that was my joy. It was sort of big job, big paycheck, and that sort of, don't want to say define me, but that was like a source. So one of the things I've really identified myself is that as we've been building Discerning, I actually just love sort of the intellectual curiosity, and I love building expertise, and I love working. I know that sounds really strange, but like some people I've got a good friend of mine, when you look up his LinkedIn, it says aspiring senior tour PGA professional, because he sold his business and he just plays golf every day. But that's for him, he pursues that. But for me, like, I love work. I love learning. I love investing. I love the idea of like finding an edge. So for me, like, David and I, my partner, we often debate this, like, are we going to be gambling investors forever? Is this all we're going to do? Or are we going to just be like known as the gambling guys? And, I actually think the truth is, like, we fell into gambling because we were looking for an edge where we had information asymmetry and regulatory competitive moats. So with that, we fell into gambling because there's a really attractive gambling market. But I actually think in 10 years, like, maybe there's something else that's similar, and we've moved from gambling was the next 10 years to maybe something different. But so that's where, I don't know. I'm just trying to like enjoy life, make enough money to, sort of keep my kids in a good school and pay for them to go to college, but just enjoy the people, the relationships. Like, that stuff's so much more important to me than, success, I guess, in many ways. I think that's been my journey is, realizing there's more to life than your paycheck and what your title says. If you do life right, you've got an abundance that comes differently. And that's actually, I'll close on that. But I told my parents this, we were all in Paris together. My parents came and met us, and we were on this bridge right behind the Notre Dame and Ile St. Louis. We're there on this bridge, and just my kids running around, my grandparents, my parents, their grandparents, being there and enjoying it and just sort of laughing and showing them Paris. I was like, man, this is a point of abundance in my life. And that's what I want to pursue, is like whatever brings me that.
Awesome. Well, thanks very much for stopping by, Davis. All the best growing Discerning Capital, and enjoy the rest of your time in France.
All right. Thanks, Jason. Great to spend the time with you.
Cheers.
The Business of Betting podcast is presented by Optimove, the #1 CRM marketing solution for the iGaming industry. 4 out of the top 5 U.S. operators personalize player experiences with Optimove, the #1 CRM marketing solution for the iGaming industry. Learn more about Optimove by requesting a demo at optimove.com/businessofbetting. And if you like what you see, you will get your first month free.